Alright guys, so this is going to be our last video on plants, and then you should be taking a quiz soon over all things plants. As always, I would encourage you to take a look at the study guide. There's a lot of good practice in there. There's lots of diagrams. Tomorrow you're going to be taking a look at the flower and dissecting the flower. It's very similar to what you did freshman year, and it's just going to be kind of hopefully a fun, easy experience for you. And so this particular lesson is going to focus on angiosperm reproduction. Now, obviously, we could go through the reproductive cycles of all of our plant groups. We could take a look at mosses and ferns and gymnosperms and angiosperms all together. But because angiosperms are by far and wide the most successful, and we're looking at more than about 90% of plant species being angiosperms, this is the one we're going to focus on. Now, I do want to remind you that as part of your test over plants and animals, one of your essays is going to be a moss life cycle. And so the mosses, for the same, for plants, remember they follow this alternation of generations where they are kind of alternating between a diploid sporophyte and a haploid gametophyte. That same thing is going to hold true. One of the biggest differences between mosses and all of the other plants, though, is that they have a dominant gametophyte, whereas all of our other plants are going to have a dominant sporophyte. And so as we talk about this angiosperm reproduction and kind of the life cycle that we're going to see here, it's going to be similar in the basic processes, but there are going to be a couple of differences with the mosses. So just in order to prepare for that, you have the answer key. You just need to kind of be able to fill out and label that on the test. You're also going to have a jellyfish life cycle coming up with animals, and so you're going to have a word bank for the two of them. And then you're going to have one other essay for plants. It is about a guy who helped save the wine industry. In your study guide, you'll find that question, and what you're going to need to do for that plant essay is just kind of research and prepare ahead. It's not going to be worth a tremendous amount of points, but you do need to research him and kind of figure out what he did that was significant for France. And so just kind of make sure that you are paying attention to those essays. I don't want you to wait until the very last minute. So let's go ahead and start our plant reproduction notes. And so the first thing is that your angiosperms, they are the most successful, and part of the reason why is because of these three F's. They have flowers, which are going to be all about attraction and reproduction. They have fruits, which are going to protect the seeds, and so we see this double protection thing going on. And then they're also going to have something called double fertilization. And so this right here is kind of breaking it down. So this is your gamete production. So this would be occurring in the gametophytes, okay? So in the male, this is going to be happening in the anther. And when you do your flower dissection, this is one of the parts that you're going to be labeling. And so the anther is where you will find the pollen sacs. And remember that your gymnosperms and your angiosperms, one of the things we added to that evolutionary cladogram was pollen. And the significance of pollen is that these plants no longer have to have water for fertilization. This pollen can spread far and wide, and water is not necessary. Now, inside that pollen grain are actually two nuclei. Okay, so we have a tube nucleus, and this is going to create the pollen tube that is going to allow that essentially plant sperm to travel down and fertilize the egg. And then you have the generative nucleus, which is actually going to produce the sperm. And so remember, we have double fertilization here, and so there's going to be two sperm in that pollen grain. And then for the female, this is going to be taking place in the ovules, which are in the ovary. And so the ovary is the part of the female flower that becomes the fruit. And so inside of this ovary are the ovules. The ovules will become the seeds, and the ovary will become the fruit. Okay, and so that's how we have these protected seeds. And so there's actually going to be 8 different nuclei that are found inside of these ovules, but there's kind of 3 that we really care about. We have the egg, and that is going to be fertilized by one of those sperm to become the zygote. And then we have these other 2 nuclei called polar nuclei, and they are going to be the ones that fuse with the other sperm. So remember, up here in our pollen grain, we have 2 sperm. One is going to fuse with the egg, That will become the zygote, or essentially the baby plant. And then the other sperm is going to fuse with these polar nuclei to form this substance that we call the endosperm. So if you're looking over here in this egg, you can see this, or this is an ovule, you can see that there's a lot of different nuclei going on. We have these synergids, we have these antipodal cells, but really the only ones we really care about are the egg itself and these polar nuclei. So these other ones are just going to be some support cells that are, I'm sure, going to do something, but we don't really have to worry about them too much. Now the flowers themselves, not all flowers are created equal, okay? And so when we're talking about plants, the plants can be described as either perfect, which means they have both the male and female sporangia, which means they can produce the male and female gametophytes, or they're going to be imperfect, which means they have male flowers and female flowers. It really just depends on the plant. So the ones that are perfect, they could potentially undergo self-pollination, and so they could technically fertilize themselves. It would still be sexual reproduction, but then some plants, they actually have a male flower and a female flower. Now, in order to actually create those seeds, we need to have pollination. And so pollination is just going to be the transfer of that pollen from the anther of a flower to the stigma. So remember, we have the male parts, which are called the stamen. They have a filament that holds up the anthers, and typically your flowers have multiple anthers. A lot of times they're going to be in multiples of 3 or multiples of 4 or 5, depending upon whether it's a monocot or a dicot. And then typically you have this one pistil, and that pistil is the female part, and it's got the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So in order for pollination to happen, this pollen is going to have to stick to that sticky stigma. Okay, now it can be cross-pollination where it's sticking to another plant. It could be self-pollination, but essentially the pollen has got to land on the stigma, and from there, that it's going to create that pollen tube. So this is the function of that one tube nucleus, is it's going to create this tube that travels down this stalk here. Now, once that pollen reaches that ovary, we're going to have these 2 fertilization events, and this is why we call it double fertilization. So once again, one of those sperm is going to fertilize the egg. Okay, so there's 2 sperm in that pollen grain. One fertilizes the egg. That is going to form a diploid zygote. This zygote is what is going to undergo cell division, and that will become the new sporophyte. So for angiosperms, this is going to become the new plant. So when we see the grass growing out of the ground, when we see the flower, when we see the tree, that's what we're looking at as the sporophyte. So one sperm fertilizes the egg. It's going to become the zygote, which is essentially the baby plant. And then the other sperm is going to join up with those polar nuclei, those other 2 nuclei that we took a look at. So notice we have 1 sperm, which is haploid. We have 2 polar nuclei that are both haploid. So notice the chromosome count, okay? It's going to be a triploid. It's going to be a triploid type of nucleus. And so what we call it is the endosperm. And the endosperm is essentially food within that seed. So one sperm is going to give rise to the baby plant, the zygote, when it fertilizes the egg. One sperm is going to join up with polar nuclei to form this endosperm, which is going to be food for the baby plant. So once again, we just see more evolutionary adaptations that are ensuring better reproductive success. And so if you think about like some of the foods that we eat, like think about a corn kernel, or think about a pinto bean, or a pea, or a lima bean. If you think about these seeds that we eat, they all kind of have like this fleshy type of material on the inside, and what that is the endosperm. So not only do we have a baby plant protected inside of a seed, but we also have food for that baby plant inside of that seed as well. And so that is one of the significant factors when we're talking about angiosperm reproduction, is that they have this double fertilization event. So once again, the pollen has to land on the sticky stigma. So the pollen is produced in the anther. It lands on the stigma, creates a pollen tube like we see here. These sperm travel down, and they're going to have these fertilization events inside of these ovules. these ovules will become the seed, and then this big ovary will become the fruit to protect those seeds. Now, as the seed matures, a lot of times they can remain dormant. If you were to go to the grocery store right now and you went to the bean aisle, you could get some of those dried beans. You could soak them in water, put them in a wet paper towel, let them sit for a little while in a warm place, and they are going to germinate. Okay, so they are not dead, they are just dormant. And so these seeds a lot of times can remain dormant for long periods of time. They have a very low metabolism. They're essentially waiting for the right growing conditions. They're waiting for the right moisture levels or the right temperature or the right chemical content. And so germination is just going to be those initial growth stages that these seeds are going to go through. Now, as I mentioned earlier, some plants, if they are perfect flowers, they have the ability to self-fertilize. They have both the male and female gametophytes. Once again, this is still sexual reproduction because we have the production of gametes. We still have a combination, we still get diversity. It just won't be as diverse as cross-pollination. So a lot of flowers try to prevent self-fertilization. Okay, they don't want to necessarily fertilize themselves because then it's not as diverse or as varied. And we know that variation is key when it comes to survival and reproduction. And so some plants have these self-incompatibility genes, which just essentially means that their own pollen cannot really fertilize or make its way all the way down to fertilize those eggs. They could have physical barriers. One thing that you may notice, it depends on the flowers that you get, but a lot of times that sticky stigma is higher than the anthers, and that way the pollen can't really just easily fall or be blown onto that stigma. Or sometimes the flowers, they'll produce the egg and sperm at different times, and that way they can't fertilize themselves. So all of these are just going to be means to help prevent self-pollination, and that way you can increase variety. All right, now the last little bit of our notes is going to be all about plant responses. And so this is one of those things that, we don't always really think about plants as being living like we are. We like to think that animals are a lot more complex, but the reality is plants are crazy complex, and they can survive really harsh conditions. It always kind of blows my mind when you see like a little tiny plant growing out of concrete, or you see these trees that regrow. And so plants are very hardy, and they really have this desire to survive just like every other living thing. And they have many different responses to a variety of stimuli in order to survive and keep going. So a lot of these responses are going to be triggered by hormones. And so we probably think about us. We know that our body has hormones, and it regulates different components, things like metabolism and, gamete production, sexual characteristics, blood sugar levels, stress. We have all different kinds of hormones. Well, plants have these chemicals too. And so by definition, a hormone is just a chemical messenger that travels. Okay, they have to be transported. They're typically produced in one area, and then they travel to another area to trigger a response. Now, for animals, they're gonna travel in the bloodstream, but for plants, they're going to be transported by that vascular tissue just like anything else. And so we're going to take a look at a few of these different tropisms, or these responses, one of which is phototropism. And at this point in our education, we should know that photo means light. So phototropism is going to be response to light. If you've ever grown plants in your home, you've probably noticed that a lot of times they will grow towards the light. Or I've noticed with some plants, like the stems will grow away from the light, but then the leaves will turn. I used to have some plants in a kitchen window, and the leaves would constantly turn and face the window, and so I would flip the plant around, and literally within a couple of days those leaves were turning back around to face that light. So the vines would kind of grow backward, and then the leaves would turn toward that light. So that is an example of phototropism. Another one is gravitropism. Sometimes this is called geotropism, and this is a response to gravity. Plants kind of naturally have this orientation of roots down, and shoots up, okay? So even if you were to take a plant and knock it over, a lot of times the roots will still grow out and down toward the ground, and then the shoots will still come out and up, okay? They have this natural tendency of roots down, shoots up. And so I don't know that this is fully understood, but there's these little plastids, these little organelles called statulas that kind of settle into different areas of the plants and kind of tell those roots and shoots which direction to grow. And then we have thigmotropism, which is response to touch. Okay, and so thigmotropism, an example of this would be like if you've ever seen those vines, they're actually really, really strong. If you've ever tried to remove them from a fence line or from other trees, but they'll have these little tendrils that kind of grow out, and they'll kind of like wave in the air until they touch something. And then once they've touched something like a fence post or another tree branch or something, they will literally wrap around multiple times. And so that's just a touch mechanism. Mimosa leaves, they kind of look like little fingers, but when something touches them, they close up. A Venus flytrap would be an example of a thigmotropism. There's some kind of little trigger inside there that when the insect touches it, it triggers the closing of that plant. So just like we can respond to various things with hormones, so can plants. So this right here is the gravitropism. The shoots are up and the roots would come out and down. This is an example of phototropism. You can see that plant bending toward the light. And this is an example of thigmotropism, the response to touch. All right, so now we're going to take a look at some of these hormones, and you actually learned these back in freshman year, but we didn't go into a lot of detail. We're going to add one. And honestly, the way I remember these, you can see that there's a variety of effects, but I try to associate each hormone with like one main word. And so for auxins, the main word that I try to remember is elongation, okay? The auxins are responsible for elongation, and they also play a major role in those tropisms. So when we're talking about like a phototropism and the plants bending toward the light, the reason they do that is because of auxins. So what auxins do is when you have the light coming in on one side of that plant, it's going to trigger the shady side of that plant. The cells are going to get longer. And so it triggers elongation of cells on a certain side, and that is what causes the plant to physically, that stem will physically bend and kind of grow toward that light. It's because of cell elongation. Now there's also a role with fruit development, and we'll see some others that are going to be, responsible for some of these other things as well. But the main thing I remember for auxins is auxins and elongation and tropisms. Our next one is cytokinins. Now this one should kind of trigger a memory of a word that you know. Hopefully you know the word cytokinesis, okay, cytokinins and cytokinesis. And so cytokinins are responsible for cell division, okay? So cytokinins and cell division. I hate this highlighter, y'all. Cytokinins and cell division. And so what happens is this is going to help stimulate germination and growth, because it's going to trigger the cells to divide, like in those apical meristems, to help the roots grow down and the shoots grow up. Our next one is gibberellins, and I always associate this one with growth. Now, if you look through here, it really doesn't say the word growth anywhere, but the gibberellins, the reason I always associate gibberellins with growth is if you've ever heard of dwarf variety plants, they're dwarf because their gibberellins aren't functional. And so it causes them to be smaller, and they don't grow as much. They don't grow to be as large. So you can see that they also work with auxins. They play a role in stem elongation. They play a role in germination, which is going to be part of that growth. And they also play a role in flowering and fruit development. So there's multifunction, but in general, the word that I try to associate with gibberellins is growth. All right, abscisic acid. Okay, now this one right here, when I see the word acid, I kind of think bad, okay? And so a lot of these other hormones are promoting things, whereas abscisic acid is kind of an inhibitory type of hormone. So the acid is going to inhibit. It's going to slow the growth. It's going to promote dormancy. A lot of these other things were promoting growth, or they were promoting cell division, or they were promoting germination, whereas this one is actually doing the opposite. It's kind of slowing it down and kind of promoting that dormancy if the conditions aren't right. It can also tell those stomata to close, which can affect the gas exchange and water loss and things like that. And then the last one is ethylene. And the word I always remember with that one is ethylene and ripening. Okay, I kind of did the little rhyme thing there. So ethylene is a gas. It triggers the ripening of fruits. So if you've ever kind of grown plants, you know, to me it's kind of exciting because I'm kind of nerdy like that. But you know, you see the flowers on your plants, and then you start to see the little tiny round structures, like maybe a little tiny tomato or a little tiny watermelon. And then over time, it just gets bigger and more colorful and sweeter. And so ethylene is the gas that triggers that. It's actually an example of positive feedback when it comes to like negative and positive feedback mechanisms, and it can lead to over ripening. But it also is really important, like when the leaves fall in the fall. It plays a role like an apoptosis in dropping those leaves and those cells dying. But in terms of the overall function, I just try to remember ethylene and ripening. All right, a couple other things we're going to look at before we call it a day on this lesson. Some other responses that you can find in plants. And I will tell you, I don't necessarily fully understand all of these. But not only do plants demonstrate phototropism, but they also demonstrate other responses to light. It's kind of like a way that they have these basic like circadian rhythms, these natural kind of life cycle processes, and those are often regulated by light. So they can detect like the direction of the light, how intense the light is, the wavelength of the light. And it seems that the red and the blues that you'll find in the sunlight, remember Roy G. Biv, they reflect the green, but they're absorbing a lot of reds and a lot of blues. But they tend to play a really important role. And one of the ways they do that is by triggering the change in these little pigments called phytochromes. So they mostly absorb red light, and there's two different forms. You have red and far red. And if you think about your electromagnetic spectrum, you have your Roy G. Biv. So your far red would be your lowest wavelengths of light in terms of visible light. And then the red would be a little bit more over, a little bit higher energy red waves. So remember that these colors, these lights are waves. And so we just have these two different forms of red. And depending on which wavelength is being absorbed the most, it can trigger these different kind of physiological changes in the plants. So when the wavelength changes, they kind of take this red form and they convert it into the far red form. And what that does is that triggers different things like flowering, some of your seasonal effects, things of that nature. I used to have a little video there, but I don't think it's available anymore. It went away. Otherwise, I would click on it and let you watch it real quick. So what these circadian rhythms are, and we have these too, it's kind of like our sleep-wake cycles, but it's kind of these natural 24-hour cycles that occur, and essentially it's going to be regulated by the exposure of light and that reset and the changes in those phytochromes. So you don't have to necessarily know all the nitty-gritty details, just understand that plants respond to light in a variety of ways, and it does kind of trigger these basic 24-hour cyclical type of processes, as well as like time of year. What tells a plant when to flower? How does a plant know that, hey, it's time to produce these flowers and reproduce? Well, it really just depends on the plant, okay? It could be an environmental cue. It could be changes in the light. It could be changes in the temperature. It could be a genetic thing, okay? These genes could be predetermined. They kind of tell them when to go from vegetative to reproductive growth. And so this is when they're not flowering to when they are flowering. A lot like right now, kind of pollen season is upon us, and so spring oftentimes is when that reproductive growth occurs. Some plants, they flower in the winter, and so these phytochromes and these light changes and these temperature changes, all of these could trigger this flowering response. Sometimes it's a temperature change. They have to be cold or they have to be warm in order for that to occur. And so another thing that can affect it kind of in response to that light is something called photoperiodism, and this has to do with the length of light and dark. Now what they found with experiments is often it's the dark that's more important, because if they would interrupt darkness, it would affect these plants. So these words are really kind of pretty easy to understand. We have short day plants and long day plants. So if you think about when do we have short days, okay, to me this is the worst part of the year, but late fall and all through the winter we have these really short days. It gets dark like at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the afternoon. We have shorter periods of light and longer periods of dark. So short day plants are going to flower and bloom during those conditions. So these are the plants that are going to flower in the winter and in the fall. Now, like I said, in experiments, they've kind of shown that if they would flash light and interrupt that darkness, it would cause them not to flower. So they determined that it was the dark period that was actually more critical than the length of the light period. And then your long day plants, we have long days in the spring and summer. So these are going to be those plants that need a shorter period of darkness, and these are going to flower in spring or summer. And then not all plants are necessarily going to be affected by that. They could be day neutral, and their flowering could be affected by other factors. So here's just kind of showing you this is our critical period here, and so depending on the type of plant, they need a certain period of dark. This would be a short day plant, and they're going to flower when they have shorter light and longer dark. This would be a long day plant, and they're going to flower whenever they have more light and less dark. All right, a couple other responses that you can find in plants. Like I mentioned earlier, they are very hardy. They always find a way to survive. We have plants that can be resistant to drought. They've kind of created these mechanisms to help conserve water. They close their stomata during the day oftentimes so they don't lose water by transpiration. They may prevent these new leaves from growing because that would require more water. They trigger their roots to grow deeper. The deeper they are, the more fibrous they are, the more water they can absorb. There's plants that are resistant to flooding. If you think about plants that live in marshy type areas where sometimes they're covered in water, sometimes they're not. A lot of times that ethylene that we mentioned, it can trigger apoptosis, which kind of creates these air pockets or these air tubes where you can drown a plant if they can't get oxygen because they're saturated with water. So they create these air tubes that still allow them to get oxygen in. Heat and cold, there's different proteins or stomatal changes that can help them survive heat. And then a lot of times in cold, they'll alter the phospholipid composition of their membranes or that cholesterol that we talked about, and that helps them survive the cold. And then plants actually are very, very, very interesting when it comes to things like pathogens. Just like we have a very complex immune system, plants do too. We're not really going to go into details, but they have these biochemical ways that they can recognize and deal with pathogens. Just like we have white blood cells that kind of go in and attack, they also have these different methods for attacking pathogens. They have that epidermal layer, things like cuticle, to kind of protect them. They have these chemicals that they can give off that they can attract the predators of the herbivores that eat them. A lot of times they do produce some kind of chemical that the predators don't like or the herbivores don't like. They may have physical adaptations like thorns to keep things from eating them. So plants are really crafty, and they've done a great job of surviving over the years. And so that's just a little bit of some of the ways that they can not only reproduce successfully in those angiosperms, but also respond to different stresses and changes in their environment. And that is going to wrap up our notes for plants. So your quiz is going to be over all things plants. It's going to be over plant diversity and structure. It's going to be over transport and nutrition. And it's also going to be over reproduction and response. So just be sure you're kind of studying up. Once again, highly encourage you to take a look at that study guide. And then don't forget you do have a couple of essays that you're going to find on your test. Not on the quiz, but there are a couple of plant essays that you'll need to do on the plant and animal test. And so that's all that I have for you today, guys. I hope you have a great one, and I will hopefully see you soon.